Somewhere in the Roman province of Asia, in the year the Apostle John was writing the book of Revelation, a man received his denarius after a full day's work. He walked to the grain market. He counted out 1 coin. He received enough wheat to feed himself for 1 day, and nothing more. No surplus, no savings, no buffer. He went home, the family ate, and tomorrow the calculation would begin again from 0. 2,000 years later, you did the same math at your kitchen table with a different currency and different numbers, and arrived at the same place he did. Paycheck gone before Friday. Receipt that makes you look twice. Quiet decisions in the grocery aisle about what gets put back. That is not inflation. That is not a policy failure awaiting the next election cycle. That is a specific economic structure that the 3rd seal of Revelation described with a precision no other passage in the book matches, and the description is for the generation watching it come true. If this kind of biblical revelation speaks to your spirit, if you have been searching for the deeper truth behind what Scripture says about the world you are living in right now, subscribe to this channel. This is where we uncover what has been hidden in plain sight. Here is what makes the 3rd seal unlike any other passage in the book of Revelation. When God speaks through his prophets, he usually speaks in the language of the cosmic, armies, angels, catastrophes that reshape heaven and earth. The 3rd seal speaks in market prices. It names specific commodities. It announces specific ratios between wages and food. It identifies which goods become scarce and which remain protected. The voice that announces this pricing structure does not emerge from a prophet on a mountain. It emerges from the throne room itself, and the economy it describes, subsistence wages purchasing subsistence food while luxury goods remain untouched, is the economy that 318 million people in crisis hunger are currently living inside of. The sequence that produced this seal did not begin in an economic crisis. It began with deception, the white horse, truth removed from the foundations of civilization, the shared moral vocabulary that restrains human behavior, quietly dissolved. From there came war, the red horse, peace extracted from the earth by a rider carrying the great sword, infrastructure destroyed, agricultural systems shattered, trade routes severed. The black horse does not arrive randomly. It arrives when there is nothing left to arrive before it. Every famine in recorded history follows the same path. The weapons came first, the crops burned second, the prices spiked third. The horsemen were not arranged in sequence by accident. They were arranged by causality. What separates Revelation 6:5-6 from every other famine prophecy in the biblical text is where the voice comes from. In the 1st seal, the living creature commanded the horse. In the 2nd seal, the same. The creature spoke. The horse responded. In the 4th seal, same structure. But in the 3rd seal, something changes. A voice speaks from en meso ton tesaron zoon, from the midst of the 4 living creatures. Revelation 4:6 places the 4 living creatures around the throne and in the center surrounding the throne. The voice that announces the prices of wheat and barley, that sets the ratio between a day's wage and a day's food, that issues the prohibition protecting oil and wine, comes from the space at the center of the throne room. The economic architecture of the 3rd seal is not a market phenomenon. It is a throne room decree. The rider carries a zygon, one Greek word that English translates as scales, and stops there. But zygon is not a single concept. It is 2 concepts occupying the same instrument simultaneously. Scales. Yes, the balance used in ancient grain markets to measure exactly how much food your coin will purchase, but also a yoke, the wooden frame placed across the necks of oxen for labor or across the necks of prisoners for bondage. Both meanings are resident in the same object. The scales measure what you can eat. The yoke binds you to the system that makes that measurement. You work under the yoke to earn the denarius. The denarius goes to the scales. The scales return 1 quart of grain. The yoke tightens again for tomorrow. This is the complete mechanism, and both halves of it are in the same rider's hand. Now hear what the voice from the center of the throne announces. A choinix of wheat for a denarius, 3 choinixes of barley for a denarius. The choinix was approximately 1 quart, the standard daily ration used in the ancient world to estimate survival-level consumption. Matthew 22 confirms that the denarius was the daily wage for common labor. The landowner in Jesus' parable agreed to pay the workers in his vineyard a denarius for the day. 1 day's labor, 1 quart of wheat. That is the math of the third seal, and it leaves no remainder. Full day of work, survival ration for 1 person, nothing left for a family, for savings, for shelter costs, for medicine, for the next crisis. The margin is gone. The buffer is gone. The distance between surviving today and not surviving tomorrow has been collapsed to the width of 1 missed shift. Run the arithmetic against a household rather than a single individual, and the third seal's economic architecture becomes its most precise. 1 denarius, 1 adult laborer working a full day, 1 quart of wheat, sufficient for the person who earned it, and a fraction of what a family of 4 requires to function. In the Roman world, a family of 4 consumed approximately 4 choinix of grain per day at minimum survival level. The denarius covered 1. The remaining 3 required either 3 additional full-day wages from workers the family did not have, or a descent into the barley economy, purchasing 3 times the volume of lesser grain for the same coin, while still providing inadequate nutrition per person. The math does not function for households. It is engineered for the survival of solitary individuals. The seal describes a wage structure where the unit under greatest pressure is not the isolated worker, but the family attempting to sustain itself on a wage that was calibrated for 1. If what you are hearing right now is revealing a pattern in Scripture that no one laid out for you before, if the text is opening in a way that connects to the economic pressure you have been feeling, write in the comments, "The scales are open." Let me see how many people are recognizing what this seal actually describes. The color of this horse is melas, not a decorative shade. The Greek word carries the weight of its biblical tradition. Melas is the black of mourning cloth, the black of the sky before a storm that destroys crops, the black of skin turning dark from starvation, which Lamentations 4:8-9 describes with terrible precision. Their appearance is blacker than soot. They are not recognized in the streets. Their skin has shriveled on their bones. It has become as dry as a stick. Jeremiah wrote that passage about the survivors of the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem, a city that starved while an army sat outside its walls. John's horse carries that same color. It does not arrive to signal metaphorical difficulty. It arrives with the color that the tradition of prophetic scripture reserved for the face of famine. Consider which creature issues the command. Revelation 4:7 describes the 4 living creatures as having faces like a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle. The lion calls the white horse. The ox, the sacrificial animal, the creature of slaughter, calls the red horse. The eagle calls the pale horse, but the third living creature, the one that summons the black horse, has a face like a man, not a supernatural animal, not a symbol of royalty or power or swiftness, a human face. The creature most associated with human intelligence, human systems, human commerce. And this creature, the one that looks most like the people it summons the horse to affect, is the one that calls the rider, who operates through human economic structures. The black horse delivers its suffering through the mechanisms humanity built, the markets, the currencies, the supply chains, the pricing algorithms, the financial instruments. The face that summons it looks like the faces of the people who designed those systems. 3 quarts of barley for the same coin, but barley was not an equivalent trade. In the ancient world, barley was feed grain. The Talmud categorized it as food for animals. The rabbis associated it with poverty and diminished status. You receive 3 times the volume for the denarius, but you are eating the grain your grandfather's ox would have eaten. This is not the third seal, offering a second option of equal nutritional value. This is the third seal, describing the downward pressure that forces families to abandon the food they want for the food they can afford. More of something lesser, delivered at the same daily cost, providing less of what the body requires. The quantity expands, the quality contracts, the price holds. The scales produce the illusion of sufficiency while measuring a deficit. Do not move past the next phrase too quickly, because it contains the most economically revealing statement in the entire 4 horsemen sequence. Do not damage the oil and the wine. Mi adikeses tu elion kai ton oinon. A prohibition. The aorist subjunctive of adikeo, not an observation of what will happen, but a firm command preventing something from happening. Olive oil and wine were the luxury commodities of the first-century Roman world. Their protection is not incidental. It is decreed from the same voice that announced subsistence prices for wheat and barley. The poverty of the many is not the accidental byproduct of a universal scarcity. The wealth of the few is actively preserved by divine command, while the working laborer counts grain. 2 economies coexist in the same verse, one measured in quarts, one exempt from measurement entirely. Amos saw this mechanism before any of the New Testament writers. Amos 8:4-6, 8 centuries before Revelation, already described the black horse's economy in operational detail. Hear this, you who trample the needy and do away with the poor of the land, saying, when will the new moon be over, that we may sell grain, and the Sabbath be ended, that we may market wheat? Skimping on the measure, boosting the price and cheating with dishonest scales. Amos describes merchants reducing the choinics while keeping the denarius fixed. The portion decreases, the price holds, the scale tips. And this mechanism, shrinking the measure, inflating the cost, manipulating the instrument of measurement, is not an ancient market aberration. Consumer researchers in 2024 found it affecting 1/3 of common grocery items in the modern economy, with some brands reducing portions by over 30% without adjusting the listed price. Amos named it 28 centuries before anyone called it shrinkflation. Consider who owned the olive orchards and the vineyards in the first-century Mediterranean world, not the day laborers counting denarii at the grain market. Land ownership in the Roman world was concentrated in the hands of the senatorial and equestrian classes, the same families who occupied the villas on the hills above the cities where laborers lived in tenement structures, paying 1/3 of their income in rent. When the third seal prohibits damage to oil and wine, it is structurally protecting the asset class, already insulated from the grain market, by virtue of owning the land that produced premium goods. The laboring poor competed for wheat rations measured by the quart. The landed wealthy sat on oil reserves and vineyard production that the rationing crisis could not touch. The prohibition does not only protect a commodity category, it protects an economic class, and it does so from the throne room, which means the protection is not incidental or temporary. It is embedded in the architecture of the third seal itself. If this content is opening something in your understanding that no one else has been willing to say plainly, let me know by liking this video. It helps this reach someone tonight who has been asking these questions alone. Micah 6:10-11 traces the same mechanism Amos documented from a different prophetic vantage point. Am I still to forget your ill-gotten treasures, you wicked house, and the short ephah, which is accursed? Shall I acquit someone with dishonest scales, with a bag of false weights? The ephah was the unit used to measure grain at the point of sale, the equivalent of the choinics in John's world. The unit the voice from the throne named when it announced a choinics for a denarius. The short ephah is the same instrument the black horse carries into the 21st century, a measuring unit deliberately calibrated to deliver less than its face value while the price remains fixed. Micah names it as accursed, not because the commodity was illegally obtained, but because the scale was dishonest, the grain was real, the measurement was false. And Micah places this practice directly in God's indictment of the economic life of the nation. Centuries before Amos named it shrinkflation, centuries before any regulatory body thought to inspect the measure. The prohibition on damaging oil and wine, the protection of luxury while necessity becomes unaffordable, is not a footnote at the end of the third seal's economic description. It is the theological center of it. What the third seal prophesies is not universal starvation. It is something more precise and more contemporary, the widening of the distance between those who eat wheat by the quart and those whose wine remains unharmed, the wealth gap, not as political complaint or economic theory, but as a divinely structured condition, decreed from the throne, operating through the human-faced creature's commission, measured by a rider whose yoke binds the laboring class while the scales remain untouched by those with oil in reserve. The distance between the economy Revelation 6 describes and the economy Leviticus 25 was designed to prevent is the distance of every generation that received the Jubilee law and chose not to implement it. The year of Jubilee was the built-in reset mechanism for exactly the oil and wine concentration dynamic that the third seal describes. Land returned to original family owners every 50 years, debts cancelled, laborers released, the accumulated distortions of half a century of market activity reversed by divine statute. The Jubilee was not idealism or primitive economic theory. It was precise engineering designed to prevent the permanent stratification between those who owned olive orchards and those who measured grain by the quart. It was never consistently implemented. The distance between Leviticus 25 and Revelation 6:6 is not a theological mystery. It is the accumulated cost of the Jubilee's non-implementation across generations of economic history, finally arriving at the point where the throne announces the structure the law was designed to prevent. The numbers available in 2026 do not require theological interpretation to recognize this structure. According to research published by Oxfam, the 12 wealthiest individuals on Earth hold combined assets exceeding $2.5 trillion. Billionaire wealth increased by $2 trillion in a single year, 3 times the rate of the previous year. 204 new billionaires were created in 12 months. Meanwhile, the poorest 50% of humanity holds approximately half of 1% of total global wealth. A person in the richest 1% owns, on average, over 8,000 times more than a person in the bottom 50%. Do not damage the oil and the wine. The prohibition is in effect. The luxury goods of the 21st century economy, the portfolios, the properties, the assets insulated from the same inflation that is reducing the choinics at your local market, remain untouched. The voice from the center of the throne set those conditions. The data confirms they are operative. The economic data from 2025 and 2026 confirms the same compression the choinics for denarius ratio describes. In the United States, median household food expenditures increased by 11.3% between 2023 and 2025, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey, while median wages grew by 4.2% over the same period, a gap of 7 percentage points in which the purchasing power of the denarius shrinks while the price of the choinics rises. In the United Kingdom, 1 in 5 households reported cutting meal sizes or skipping meals in 2025, not because food was unavailable, but because wages had not kept pace with food prices. Food banks in developed economies, a category that barely existed 3 decades ago, now serve working families as their primary client demographic. The scales are active. The measurement confirms the rider's commission is operative in the economies that consider themselves most insulated from famine. Haggai 1:6 captures the lived experience of the black horse economy in language that needs no translation into modern terms. You have planted much, but harvested little. You eat, but never have enough. You drink, but never have your fill. You put on clothes, but are not warm. You earn wages, only to put them in a purse with holes in it. The purse with holes. Money that comes in and disappears before it accomplishes what it was earned to accomplish. This is not the language of unemployment or poverty in the traditional sense. It is the language of employed people whose wages fail to sustain life, who work a full day, earn a full denarius, and discover that the denarius covers less than a full day requires. Millions of working families in 2026 would use Haggai's metaphor instinctively to describe their own financial reality if someone handed them the vocabulary. If you have been feeling like the economic pressure you and the people around you have been experiencing connects to something deeper than a policy cycle, I left something for you in the first pinned comment. It is for those who are ready to go beyond the surface. Hosea 4:1-3 describes these conditions 8 centuries before Revelation's third seal, using language that reads less like prophecy and more like a report filed from inside an active famine. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. There is only cursing, lying and murder, stealing and adultery. They break all bounds, and bloodshed follows bloodshed. Because of this, the land dries up, and all who live in it waste away. The beasts of the field, the birds in the sky, and the fish in the sea are swept away. Notice the structure Hosea presents. Moral dissolution first, then the land dries up, then the food chain collapses. Hosea's sequence is the white horse followed by the black horse, the same progression Revelation encodes in the seal arrangement. The third seal did not arrive in the New Testament revelation without preparation. It had been described in precise operational detail before the writing prophets of Israel were done recording. The Roman economy, in which John's first readers lived, was not a wage economy in the modern sense. There was no guaranteed employment, no labor contract, no minimum standard protecting the worker's income. The system operated through patronage. Wealthy landowners who required day laborers for agricultural work would hire in the morning marketplace, exactly the scenario Matthew 20 documents. If you were not selected at the morning hiring, you received nothing that day. If the harvest was poor, fewer workers were needed. If the patron chose not to hire, there was no legal mechanism to compel him. The denarius was not a right. It was a daily contingency that required both the availability of work and the will of a patron to offer it. Under this structure, the choinix for denarius ratio represented not the worst possible outcome, but the outcome when everything functioned correctly. 1 full day's correctly compensated labor still returned only survival. Any interruption, illness, injury, conflict, drought, a patron's decision, and the calculation fell below even that floor. The agricultural reality behind the third seal is not theoretical. 673 million people experienced hunger in 2024, 8.2% of the global population. 318 million now face crisis levels of food insecurity, more than double the number from 2019. The FAO Food Price Index averaged 127.2 in 2025, a 4.3% increase from the year before. Vegetable oil prices, the ancient oil of the prohibition, surged 17%, reaching levels not seen since 2022. Cereal prices rose to their highest in 9 months by February 2026. The wheat is getting more expensive. The oil prices are climbing, but the oil is still there. The denarius buys less grain every quarter. The pattern the throne announced is the pattern the data confirms. For the first time in a single calendar year, famine was officially declared twice in 2025, in Sudan and in Gaza. Not food insecurity, not elevated hunger. Famine, the classification that means people are dying of starvation in measurable numbers while the world watches. In Sudan, over 25 million people are acutely food insecure. In Gaza, famine conditions were confirmed by the Integrated Food Security Phase classification in August 2025. Food has been documented being used as a weapon of war in both conflicts. Agricultural infrastructure deliberately destroyed, aid flows deliberately obstructed, the supply chain weaponized. The red horse created the conditions. The black horse measured what remained, and what remained was not enough. The compound pressure driving the third seal's mechanism is not reducible to a single cause, and this is precisely what the SEAL sequence anticipated. The 2024 State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World report identified 3 overlapping drivers behind current famine conditions: armed conflict, economic shocks, and climate-related disruptions. In that sequence, which mirrors the SEAL sequence exactly, climate disruption alone accounts for approximately 31% of the increase in acute food insecurity since 2020, according to FAO analysis. But climate disruption interacting with active conflict, the red horse and the black horse operating simultaneously in the same geography, produces food system collapse at a rate neither driver achieves independently. Sudan demonstrates this interaction. Conflict interrupted the planting season in the same regions experiencing below-average rainfall, producing crop failures in territories where agricultural recovery was already impossible. 2 horsemen operating in the same territory, one cascading catastrophe, the third and fourth still accumulating. The connection Revelation 6 draws between the second and third seals is not symbolic, it is causal, and history confirms it with every conflict on record. War destroys agricultural infrastructure. War displaces farmers. War diverts national resources from food production to weapons manufacturing. The global military spending figure of 2024, $2,718 billion, represents not only the weight of the red horse's machera, but the direct cost to the black horse's scales. Every billion redirected toward the instruments of war is a billion not spent on grain storage, irrigation infrastructure, seed distribution, or the agricultural systems that determine whether the choinix contains a full measure or a reduced one. The horsemen share the same economy. The sword funds the scales. The structural fragility of the global food supply chain was documented before the twin famine declarations, and the documentation was set aside with the same consistency that characterizes every era when the warning arrives before the consequence. The disruption of Ukrainian grain exports following the 2022 invasion removed approximately 12% of global wheat supply from the market in a single year. Red Sea shipping disruptions in 2024 and 2025, driven by attacks on commercial vessels, increased the cost of food transportation between Europe and Asia by as much as 300% on certain routes. Adding directly to the price increases the FAO tracked. The grain storage infrastructure that Joseph recommended to Pharaoh, storing 20% of harvest during years of abundance, does not exist in any coordinated form in the modern global economy. The system runs on just-in-time supply chains, calibrated for optimal conditions. The third seal does not operate under optimal conditions. Neither does the system designed to feed the world. 2.6 billion people, 1/3 of the global population, cannot afford a healthy diet, not a premium diet, not specialty foods, the minimum nutritional standard that the human body requires to function without long-term degradation. The average daily cost of a healthy diet is $4.46 per person. For billions of people on Earth right now, that number exceeds their daily purchasing power. Half the world's children cannot access adequate nutrition. In low-income countries, 68% of children lack the dietary requirements for normal physical and cognitive development. The zygon is not weighing hypothetical grain. It is weighing the future of a generation born under the open third seal. 2 Kings 6:24-25 provides the biblical archive's most extreme record of the black horse economy in historical operation. A passage that reads like a price report filed from inside a siege. There was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver, and a quarter of a cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. A donkey's head, an item with no normal market value, waste material from the slaughterhouse, sold for the equivalent of months of labor. The siege had collapsed the entire value structure of the market. Items that were garbage became currency. Items that were food became inaccessible. This is what the red horse's machaira does to the black horse's scales when the conflict is sustained long enough. It inverts all economic value until the most desperate transactions become the only transactions available. Nehemiah 5:1-5 provides the most direct biblical record of what the black horse economy produces when it runs long enough without intervention. We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine. We are borrowing money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our children to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless, because our fields and our vineyards belong to others. The progression is documented in exact stages. Food crisis, then debt on collateral, then tax obligation on collateral, then children pledged as labor, then property transferred to creditors. This is not a theoretical worst case. Nehemiah witnessed it in real time within his own community. The black horse does not stop at hunger. It rides until the yoke has transferred ownership of everything the laboring class once held. Deuteronomy 28:47-48 connects the black horse's yoke to a theological root that most prosperity teaching prefers to step around. Because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity, therefore in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. He will put an iron yoke on your neck. The zygon of the third seal, is not the first yoke in the biblical text. Iron yokes appear in Deuteronomy as the specific consequence of prosperity consumed without gratitude. Abundance received and exhausted without acknowledgement of the source. The generation that had everything the choinics could hold and spent it without reference to the hand that filled it receives the generation that measures what the choinics holds now. The black horse's most theologically significant work is not accomplished through hunger alone. It is accomplished through the dependency that hunger creates. A population that works a full day for a single day's food does not retain the margin to refuse any offer of relief, regardless of what that offer costs. This is the connection between the third seal and the economic system of Revelation 13. The mark of the beast does not arrive as a sudden imposition on a prosperous and independent population. It arrives as a solution to a problem that already exists. The third seal creates the conditions in which economic access becomes the population's primary concern. Above political liberty, above theological conviction, above the prophetic warnings that have been issued throughout the entire seal sequence. A population rationed to 1 choinics per denarius is a population positioned to receive any system that promises to resolve the rationing problem at whatever theological cost that system requires. Ezekiel 4:9-10 documents a moment in the prophetic record where God commanded his own prophet to eat measured rations as a sign to Israel, to physically embody the third seal's condition as testimony. Take wheat and barley, beans and lentils, millet and spelt. Put them in a storage jar and use them to make bread for yourself. You are to eat it during the 390 days you lie on your side. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day, and eat it at set times. 20 shekels of food per day, a precisely calibrated subsistence ration. Ezekiel was required to measure it, weigh it, and eat it at specified times so that the precision of scarcity became visible to Israel. The prophet's body became the scale. His meal became the evidence. God embedded the black horse's economic testimony into Ezekiel's physical life before Revelation described it in apocalyptic terms, so that the generation would have already seen the seal in the body of a man eating measured grain outside the walls of a city that had not yet fallen. Revelation 13, 16, 17 reveals where the black horse's economic architecture is heading. It also forced all people, great and small, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hands or on their foreheads, so that they could not buy or sell unless they had the mark. The third seal establishes economic scarcity. The mark of the beast weaponizes that scarcity into total control. The progression is not coincidental. The black horse conditions the population for what the beast will offer: an economic system with restored access, guaranteed food, protected stability, at the cost of compliance. When the scales have rationed the denarius to its minimum and the yoke has tightened past the point of individual endurance, the system that offers relief from rationing in exchange for allegiance becomes attractive in ways it never could have been in a world of abundance. The third seal is not the final economic judgment. It is the preparation for the one that follows. James 5:1-4 reads as a direct prophetic address to the class that the third seal protects, the oil and wine holders. And the protection carries an expiration date that the verse makes unmistakable. Now listen, you rich people, weep and wail because of the misery that is coming on you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workers who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The wages of the laboring class, the people earning 1 denarius for 1 quart of grain, are crying out. James locates the testimony of that cry, not in a protest movement, but in the ear of the Lord Almighty. The oil and wine are preserved during the third seal's ride. They will not survive James's testimony. Proverbs 11:26 places the oil and wine protection of Revelation 6:6 in the context of divine evaluation. People curse the one who hoards grain, but they pray God's blessing on the one who is willing to sell. The proverb identifies 2 responses to grain scarcity. One hoards, withholds supply from the market to protect personal reserves or drive prices higher. One sells, releases supply at accessible prices, accepting lower margin for the sake of the community's access. Proverbs assigns community prayer to the seller. It assigns a public curse to the hoarder. When the third seal is open, both figures operate simultaneously in every economy on earth. The distribution centers releasing grain to whoever can pay the denarius, and the commodity trading algorithms timing their releases to maximize price at the exact moment the market can bear maximum extraction. The proverb has not expired. The blessing and the curse are still being distributed according to the same criterion Proverbs named 3,000 years ago. Genesis 41 provides the oldest documented biblical example of someone recognizing the black horse's mechanism before it arrived and preparing accordingly. Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream, 7 fat cows, 7 thin cows, as 7 years of agricultural abundance, followed by 7 years of famine, severe enough to erase the memory of the abundance. He recommended storing 20% of the harvest during each year of surplus. Pharaoh implemented the plan. Egypt survived the famine. The surrounding nations came to Egypt to buy grain. At whatever price the scales demanded, The nations that prepared had oil and wine. The nations that consumed without storing came with empty denarii. Joseph's story is the counter-narrative embedded within the black horse's mechanism. The pattern is identifiable before it arrives, and the one who recognizes it and prepares can sit on the other side of the scales. The question is whether any authority in any generation is willing to listen to the dream. Isaiah 55:1-2 speaks the economy of the lamb directly against the economy of the rider. Come, all you who are thirsty, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come buy and eat. Come buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why spend money on what is not bread, and your labor on what does not satisfy? The inversion is complete. The black horse economy says 1 denarius buys 1 choinix. Isaiah's economy says those who have no money come anyway. The black horse says oil and wine are protected for those who already have them. Isaiah says wine and milk without cost. This is not a metaphor about spiritual abundance. It is a prophetic preview of the economy that supersedes the third seal. The economy of the kingdom, where the scales are replaced by invitation and the yoke is replaced by rest. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, Jesus said in Matthew 11:28, and I will give you rest. The yoke of the Zygon has an alternative. It was offered before the seal was opened, and it will remain on offer while the rider holds the scales. Acts 11:27-30 records the early church's response when Agabus prophesied that famine was coming, and the response defines the believer's posture under the black horse in a way no individual strategy can replicate. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. The community functioned as a counter-economy. What the scales were rationing, the community was sharing. What the voice from the throne had measured in quarts, the hands of the church distributed in abundance. The response to the third seal within the body of Christ is not hoarding, not panic, not political strategy, though individual wisdom and community planning are not wrong. The response is the voluntary redistribution that makes the church a living demonstration that the Lamb's economy operates on different scales than the rider's. Acts 2:44-45 records the organizational structure, the earliest Christian community built in direct response to a world operating under the patronage economy that produced the denarius for choinix ratio. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. This was not abstract theology enacted in comfortable conditions. Jerusalem in the first century operated under the same economic pressure that determined whether a day laborer received his denarius at the morning hiring market. The first disciples lived inside the black horse's mechanism. They felt the yoke, they counted the grain. Their response was to construct an internal redistribution network that did not wait for the empire's economic system to solve a problem the empire's economic system was structurally producing. The early church was not an alternate government. It was an alternate economy, operating by different scales, measuring by different standards, practicing by its organizational life that the voice from the throne's prices were not the only economic reality available to those who belonged to the Lamb. 2 Corinthians 8:13-14 articulates the theological principle behind the early church's economic practice, with a precision that names the exact dynamic the third seal exploits. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn their need will supply what you need. Equality, isotes in the Greek, the balance point of the scale, the moment when both sides of the zygon carry equal weight. Paul is describing the believer's obligation as the counterweight to what the rider carries. The rider's zygon measures scarcity and assigns it structurally to the laboring class. The church's practice redistributes the weight until the scale achieves balance, those with oil and wine releasing it toward those counting grain by the quart until the measure between them narrows toward the same line. Not government mandate, not market correction. A voluntary redistribution driven by the recognition that abundance on one side of the scales is not theologically separate from the deficit on the other. Philippians 4:11-13, written from a Roman prison by a man who knew both abundance and need from direct personal experience, contains the spiritual technology for surviving the black horse without being destroyed by it. I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. Learned. Twice Paul uses the word learned, emathon and memamumai in the Greek. This is not a natural condition. It is a skill acquired through practice. The contentment that survives the black horse's scales is not the passive result of having enough food. It is the active result of having learned where enough actually comes from the one whose strength Paul names in the next sentence. Romans 8:35-37 draws the boundary that no horseman has authority to cross. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? Paul lists famine by name. He lists the sword by name. The instruments of the second and third seals appear in Paul's list, and his declaration is not that believers will be exempt from either. It is that neither has the legal authority to terminate the relationship between the believer and the Lamb. In all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. Hypernicomen, not barely surviving, not white-knuckling through the rationing, but overwhelming triumph through the one who loved. The black horse can compress the choinix and exhaust the denarius. It cannot compress that declaration. Luke 12:15-21, the parable of the rich man whose harvest exceeded his storage capacity, arrives in the Gospels as the precise diagnosis of the generation that the black horse finds most unprepared. The ground of a certain rich man yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, "What shall I do? I have no room to store my crops." So he said, "I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store my surplus grain." The solution to abundance is larger storage. The solution to the scales tipping toward famine is personal hoarding rather than communal distribution. Jesus does not identify this man as wicked in the way James 5 identifies the rich oppressor. He is a farmer who had a good year and made a sensible economic decision. But God's response in the parable names what that decision costs. "You fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself?" The choinix for denarius economy and the barn expansion economy exist simultaneously. Only one of them has an expiration date. Only one of them is built on something that lasts past tonight. Matthew 6:25-26 speaks directly to the anxiety the black horse manufactures. Do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink. Jesus addresses the specific content of the third seal's psychological damage. The Greek word for worry, merimnao, means to be pulled in different directions, to be divided in attention, to have your focus fractured by competing concerns about survival. The black horse does not only ration food, it rations attention, peace, and the capacity to trust, pulling the believer's focus from the provider to the provision, from the lamb to the scales. Jesus' command is a counterintelligence instruction. When the rider works to redirect your attention to what you will eat, actively redirect it back to the Father who feeds birds that never filed a business plan. 1 Kings 17:8-16 documents the supernatural alternative that operates inside the black horse's economy rather than above it. Elijah, directed to a widow in Zarephath during a drought severe enough to qualify as a third seal famine event, arriving to find a woman gathering sticks to cook the last handful of flour she owned before she and her son died of starvation. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, "The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry, until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." The jar of flour, the jug of oil, the same commodities the third seal addresses, grain and oil, become the exact provision point for God's supernatural intervention. The provision does not arrive by bypassing the economic reality of the drought. It arrives through it, one meal at a time, the jar never empty, the jug never dry, exactly enough each day. The choinix never exceeded survival quantity, but it never fell to zero. That is the boundary the shepherd holds, not above the seal's conditions, but inside them, and present. The third seal does not operate alone. The seals accumulate, each one adding its weight to what the previous ones already placed on the earth. The white horse is still riding, the red horse is still riding, the black horse has joined them. And Revelation 6:7-8 describes the pale horse, death with Hades following, as being given power to kill by sword, famine, plague, and wild beasts. Sword, famine. The red horse and the black horse appear in the pale horse's list because the pale horse does not bring new instruments. It brings the accumulated weight of the previous instruments to their mortality threshold. The cascade is in motion. The rider with the scales is contributing his portion to the total that the fourth rider will harvest. This is why the question of whether the third seal is open is not academic. The answer determines what follows. Zephaniah 1:11-13 provides another voice in the long prophetic tradition that anticipated the third seal's economic testimony. "Wail, you who live in the market district. All your merchants will be wiped out. All who trade with silver will be destroyed. At that time I will search Jerusalem with lamps and punish those who are complacent, who are like wine left on its dregs, who think, 'The Lord will do nothing, either good or bad.'" Zephaniah identifies the same complacency that makes the third seal's arrival most effective. The merchants who have been insulated from loss, who have watched the scales operate against the laboring class and concluded that the system is stable because it has not yet disrupted them. Wine left on its dregs, settled undisturbed, confident in its own position. This is the theological profile of the oil and wine class when the third seal reaches its fullness. Not actively malicious, not engaged in the specific mechanisms Amos described, simply settled. And Zephaniah places settled complacency in the market district as the address where the final accounting will arrive. Revelation 7:16-17 carries a promise that is specific to the experience of the third seal's survivors. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the center of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water. Never again will they hunger. The promise targets the experience by name. Those who worked a full day for a quart of grain, who watched the zygon measure their food and the yoke, bind them to the system and the oil and wine flow to those who needed it least, receive a specific promise. Never again. The scales have an expiration date. The yoke has an expiration date. The choinix has an expiration date. The lamb's provision does not. Revelation 22:1-2 reveals the economy on the other side of the seal sequence in images that invert every measurement the third seal imposed. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, as clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city. On each side of the river stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. 12 crops per year, from a tree that produces every month without interruption, watered by a river flowing directly from the throne, not through market mechanisms, not through wage negotiations, not through the denarius system. The tree does not produce 1 quart per coin. It yields 12 crops to everyone on both sides of the river simultaneously. The Lamb who allowed the third seal to be opened, who sits at the center of the throne from which the pricing decree emerged, is the same Lamb who will replace the zygon with a river. The scales have a season. The river has no ending. The data says the third seal is open. 318 million in crisis hunger. Famine declared twice in a single year. 2.6 billion people unable to afford a healthy diet. Wealth concentration at levels that the oil and wine prohibition of Revelation 6.6 describes with first-century precision. The rider's commission is active. The voice from the throne has set the prices. The scales are weighing. But the Lamb who opened the third seal also opened a table in the wilderness, multiplied 5 loaves for 5,000, and said in John 6:35, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry. The rider holds the zygon. The Lamb holds the loaves. Both economies exist simultaneously in the same world. The generation living under the open third seal is the generation choosing every day which economy defines them. The one announced by the voice from the throne that set the price of subsistence, or the one announced by the Lamb himself, who said, Come, eat, it costs you nothing. 1 Timothy 6:6-8 offers the simplest economic theology available to the generation under the scales. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, and we can take nothing out of it. But if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. A great gain, not as the accumulation of what the oil and wine class hoards, but as the combination of trust and sufficiency that the black horse cannot measure, because it operates entirely outside the economy the rider administers. The scales cannot weigh it. The yoke cannot bind it, the choinix cannot contain it, and the rider has no commission over it because it was never issued from the earth. Psalm 37:25, the testimony of a man who lived long enough to see many seal-like seasons and came out the other side. I was young, and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. David does not say the famine did not come. He says the righteous were not abandoned inside it. The black horse can ride, the scales can weigh. The denarius can buy less every quarter until the margin disappears entirely. But the God who fed Israel in the wilderness with bread that appeared on the ground 6 days a week, who sustained Elijah through a drought with provisions brought by ravens, who fed 5,000 with 5 loaves and collected 12 baskets of surplus, that God has not exhausted his inventory or retired his methods. Psalm 23:1 says only one thing about the economy of those who belong to the shepherd: I shall not want. The black horse cannot revise that verse. No rider can. If you stayed until the end, write in the comments, the Lamb is the bread. I have placed another video on your screen right now, your next step into what Revelation reveals about the seals that are opening in our generation. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video.